The line between myth and reality is a thin, fraying thread, one that Alex had spent his entire career pulling at. As a journalist, he had always been drawn to the stories that lingered in the shadows, the ones whispered in hushed tones over late-night drinks or typed frantically into online forums. Urban legends were not mere fiction to him. They were the collective nightmares of society, and within their twisted narratives often lay a sliver of terrifying truth. His desk was a testament to this obsession, littered with case files on phantom hitchhikers, spectral hounds, and haunted radio frequencies. Yet, for all his research, he had never found the story, the one that would not just send a chill down the spine, but fundamentally unmake a person's sense of safety in the world. That changed on a rain-slicked Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the city outside his office window blurred into a monochrome smear of gray concrete and weeping glass. The catalyst was a casual remark from a colleague, a seasoned crime reporter with a weary cynicism that Alex had always admired. Over a shared pot of bitter, overbrewed coffee, the man mentioned an old cold case, an unsolved 911 call. It was a story that had briefly flickered in the news cycle before being buried by more explicable tragedies. The details were sparse, but potent. A man's frantic, disembodied voice pleading for help, trapped inside his own home, followed by a silence so absolute it felt like a void. The kicker, the detail that made Alex's pen still above his notepad, was the final chilling conclusion of the investigation. The call, they determined, was not live. It was a pre-recording, a ghost in the machine. A thrill, sharp and electric, coursed through him. This was more than a ghost story. It was a paradox. It was fear, weaponized through the very technology designed to offer salvation. In that moment, the idea for his book crystallized. He would not write another anthology of campfire tales. He would chronicle 8 true scary stories, narratives rooted in documented events and first-hand accounts, starting with this enigmatic 911 call. He would find the people who had lived these nightmares and trace the common threads of dread that connected them. Back in his apartment that evening, the thrill began to curdle into a low, persistent unease. The city lights twinkled like a field of distant, indifferent stars. He cleared a space on his cluttered dining table, which now served as his command center, and began to set up interviews. Each email sent, each phone call scheduled, felt like casting a line into a deep, dark lake. He was not just a journalist seeking a story anymore. He was an architect of his own descent, building a staircase into the unknown. He thought about the nature of fear itself, how it could be broadcast, recorded, and replayed, how a voice on a tape could be more terrifying than a monster in the closet, because it was real, it had happened, and its mystery remained unsolved. He was chasing phantoms that had left tangible footprints, and with every step he took, the line between myth and reality, the very thread he had always pulled at, felt dangerously close to snapping.
If you're watching this alone, I advise you to stop now.
The voice of a stranger in the dark, pleading for a salvation that would never come, can haunt a person more deeply than any specter. Alex sat across from Maria in a quiet corner of a nearly empty diner, the vinyl booth creaking with every slight shift of their weight. Steam rose from 2 untouched mugs of coffee, forming a fragile veil between them. Maria, a 911 dispatcher with 15 years on the job, had eyes that held a permanent, weary vigilance. But as she began to speak, a different kind of shadow passed over them. A raw, unprocessed fear that time had failed to erode. Her hands, usually steady enough to guide panicked citizens through CPR or talk down a jumper, trembled slightly as she wrapped them around the warm ceramic of her mug. She described the call that had come in on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday night, a shift like any other. The console had lit up, and she had answered with her standard calm greeting, expecting anything from a fender bender to a domestic dispute. What she received was a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure in her headset, followed by a burst of static. And then, the voice. It was a man's voice, choked with a desperation that was instantly, gut-wrenchingly real. He wasn't screaming. His terror was too complete for that. He whispered, his words tumbling out in a frantic, broken stream. He claimed he was trapped inside his own home, that the doors were locked from the outside, the windows sealed shut. He spoke of shadows that moved against their will, and a cold that seeped from the walls themselves. Maria, her training kicking in, tried to pinpoint his location, to get a name, an address, anything solid to grasp onto. But the man's responses were disjointed, as if he were answering questions she hadn't yet asked, describing a home invasion by an unseen, intangible force. Alex watched, mesmerized, as Maria's gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the diner's rain-streaked window, lost in the memory. She recounted the crescendo of the man's panic, his voice cracking as he described the feeling of something, a presence, closing in on him, the air growing thick and unbreathable. And then, the most chilling part, the sudden, absolute silence. It wasn't the silence of a hung-up call. It was the dead, hollow silence of a void, as if the connection had been severed, not from this world, but from existence itself. Maria had stayed on the line, calling out into that nothingness, her own professional composure beginning to fray. It was in the ensuing investigation that the true horror solidified. The techs had traced the call, not to a besieged suburban house, but to a network of routed signals that led to a dead end. And then came the final soul-shattering analysis of the audio recording. The pauses between her questions and his answers were a mathematically perfect, consistent length. The background noise, a faint, almost imperceptible hum, was a loop. The realization had struck her with the force of a physical blow. The frantic, terrified man, the palpable fear that had coiled in her own stomach as she listened. It had all been a recording, a pre-recorded message of a man's final, desperate moments, played for her, and her alone, on a random Tuesday night. Maria's revelation hung in the air between them, a specter of impossible truth. The investigation, she continued, her voice now a hollow monotone, had been thorough and utterly futile. Police had scoured the potential locations the call's convoluted routing suggested. They found nothing. No signs of struggle, no disturbed homes, no missing persons reports that matched the terrified description from the recording. The digital footprint evaporated into the ether, a ghost trail leading to server farms and abandoned IP addresses. The official report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic closure, citing an elaborate, untraceable hoax. Case closed. But Alex saw the truth in the way Maria's knuckles whitened around her coffee mug, in the slight unconscious flinch when a truck backfired outside the diner. The case was closed in a filing cabinet, but it remained wide open in her mind, a raw, festering wound. The fear had not dissipated with the official explanation. It had simply mutated, burrowing deeper. It was the fear of the unknowable, the violation of a system she trusted, the chilling notion that reality itself could be so easily and malevolently fabricated. She was not afraid of a man in a house. She was afraid of the silence that had followed the recording, a silence that felt less like an absence and more like a presence listening back. A cold resolve crystallized within Alex. This was not a hoax, it was a symptom. It was the first terrifying piece of evidence for his book, a perfect example of how modern technology could warp the very fabric of reality, turning the tools of safety into conduits for primal dread. He thanked Maria, his voice soft with a respect that felt inadequate, and watched her walk away, her shoulders set against a weight only she could feel. He sat alone in the booth for a long time, the diner's fluorescent lights humming a flat, indifferent tune. The 911 call was more than a story. It was a key. It spoke to a fundamental ancient fear, the fear of being trapped, of being unheard, of a cry for help lost in the void. But this ancient fear had found a new, terrifyingly efficient vessel. It had been digitized, stripped of its human origin, and broadcast back into the world, a perfect echo of terror. He left the diner and walked through the cooling evening, the city lights now seeming like a million watchful eyes. The story was no longer an abstract concept. It had a face, it had a voice, it had a victim in Maria, whose life had been subtly but permanently altered. Alex felt the weight of his own mission settle upon him. He would uncover the truth behind this call, not just for the sake of his book, but as a form of exorcism for the fear it had left in its wake. He understood now that he was not just documenting scary stories. He was tracking a new kind of phantom, one that did not haunt old houses, but instead inhabited the invisible networks that connected the modern world. A ghost in the machine that knew how to press every one of humanity's most primal buttons. Some silences are not empty, but full. They press against the eardrums with the weight of unspoken things, of watchful stillness. This was the silence that greeted Sarah as she stepped across the threshold of the remote cabin. A silence so profound, it felt like walking into a held breath. Alex watched her across the small table in her sunlit apartment, a world away from the isolation she described, and saw the memory cloud her eyes, pulling her back into those deep woods. She had taken the house-sitting job on a whim, a chance to escape the city's constant hum and find some quiet to finish her thesis. The drive had been a slow unraveling of civilization, the paved roads giving way to gravel, the gravel to a dirt track that wound like a scar through an ocean of pine and spruce. When her GPS finally lost its signal, she knew she had arrived at the edge of the map. The cabin itself was a picture of rustic solitude, built from dark, weathered logs and nestled in a clearing that seemed to swallow the daylight. A heavy iron key waited under a moss-covered stone, cold and gritty in her palm. The first oddity was subtle, a thing she almost dismissed as forgetfulness. She had placed her car keys on the rough-hewn kitchen counter next to her wallet. When she turned back from unpacking a grocery bag, the keys were on the small wooden table by the front door. She shrugged it off, blaming the fatigue of the long drive. The cabin was exactly as the owners had described, a single main room with a sleeping loft above, a small kitchenette, and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. It was cozy, yet the air within felt old and thick, resistant to her presence. As dusk began to bleed into the forest, the silence began to change. It was no longer just an absence of sound, but a canvas for other, fainter impressions. Sitting by the crackling fire she had built, a book open but unread on her lap, she first heard them. Whispers. They were not voices. Not quite. They were the sibilant suggestion of voices, the ghost of a conversation happening just beyond the range of hearing. They seemed to thread through the sound of the settling logs and the wind outside, so faint that when she held her breath to listen, they vanished, only to return the moment her focus wavered. A cold prickle, unrelated to the evening chill, danced along her spine. That was when the feeling began to crystallize, a sensation as tangible as a change in air pressure. She was not alone. The conviction settled deep in her gut, a cold, hard stone of certainty. It was not a feeling of being watched from outside, through a window. It was a feeling of shared space, of another consciousness occupying the same square footage, moving just outside her peripheral vision. Her skin began to crawl with the unnerving sensation of unseen proximity, as if something were standing directly behind her. Its presence so close she could feel the displacement of the air, a chill that had nothing to do with the dying fire. She spent the rest of the evening with her back to the stone hearth, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the cabin, every shadow seeming to hold a deeper, more solid darkness within. The cozy retreat had become a stage, and she was an uninvited player in a scene whose rules she did not understand. Sleep that night was a fractured, shallow thing, snatched in the spaces between the creaks and sighs of the old cabin. Every groan of timber was a footstep on the loft stairs. Every rustle of the wind in the pines was a hand brushing against the outside wall. Sarah woke with the first gray light of dawn, her body aching with a tension that had nothing to do with the unfamiliar mattress. The memory of the whispers and the crawling sensation of a presence lingered like a foul odor in the air. She told herself it was just the isolation playing tricks on her mind, the power of suggestion in a place too quiet for a city dweller's nerves. But the rationalization felt thin, a fragile shield against a dread that was quickly solidifying into certainty. Her morning routine became a ritual of security. She checked every window, testing the latches with a firm hand, and made a deliberate show of turning the heavy deadbolt on the front door, the metallic clunk echoing in the silent main room. The sound was supposed to be a promise of safety, a definitive line between her and the vast, watchful woods outside. She busied herself with mundane tasks. The clatter of a coffee mug and the hiss of the propane stove providing a semblance of normalcy. But the silence always returned, thicker and more oppressive than before, and with it, the feeling of being studied from the shadows. It was when she returned from a brief, nerve-wracking trip to the outhouse that she found the first undeniable proof she was not imagining things. The front door, which she had locked so emphatically barely an hour before, stood slightly ajar. Not wide open, but a mere 2-inch gap, as if someone had gently pulled it back just enough to peer inside. A cold wave of nausea washed over her. She stood frozen on the porch, her breath pluming in the crisp air, staring at that sliver of darkness between the door and the frame. There were no footprints in the damp earth around the steps, no sign of forced entry. It was as if the lock had simply decided to disengage on its own. From that moment, the cabin itself seemed to turn against her. Doors she was certain she had closed were found slightly open. The narrow door to the broom closet, the heavy door to the root cellar. Each discovery was a fresh jolt of terror, a silent message that the rules of her reality were no longer in effect. The whispers returned, no longer faint suggestions but clearer, more distinct, though the words remained just beyond comprehension. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a low, sibilant commentary on her growing panic. She stopped trying to rationalize it. The fear was now a living thing in the cabin with her, a second occupant that moved unseen and mocked her attempts at control. The climax came on the third night. Driven by a desperate, frantic energy, she decided to search the cabin from top to bottom, no longer a guest, but an investigator in her own nightmare. It was in the deepest shadow of the sleeping loft, behind a heavy wool blanket that served as a makeshift curtain, that her fingers found the irregularity. A section of the log wall felt different, not rough and solid, but slightly yielding. Pushing aside the blanket, she saw it, a hairline crack, outlining a small square panel, so cleverly integrated into the grain of the wood, it was nearly invisible. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pried at it with trembling fingers. With a soft, gritty scrape, the hidden compartment swung open. Inside was not dust or forgotten tools, but a collection of items that stole the breath from her lungs. A tarnished silver locket, cold against her palm. A child's small, worn leather shoe. A stack of faded photographs showing a family she did not recognize, their smiles frozen in a time long past. And a single handwritten journal, its pages filled with a frantic looping script that spoke of being watched, of things moving in the night, of a presence that shared the walls. Staring into that small, dark space, surrounded by the intimate relics of a stranger's life, the final chilling truth crashed down upon her. The whispers, the open doors, the pervasive feeling of another. It had not been her imagination fraying at the edges. Someone, or something, had been inside the cabin with her all along, moving through the hidden arteries of the structure, watching her from the shadows, its existence now confirmed by the poignant, terrifying artifacts in her hands. In that moment, the solid ground of her sanity crumbled, and she was left adrift in a sea of primal, unanswerable fear. A child's toy, abandoned in the woods, carries a particular kind of sorrow, a relic of innocence left to the indifferent decay of nature. But what Alex found himself investigating was not a story of sorrow. It was a narrative of deliberate, chilling intent. The tip had come from a wildlife biologist's forum, a buried thread with a grainy, zoomed-in photograph attached. It showed a doll, its porcelain face smeared with dirt, propped against the gnarled root of an ancient oak in the heart of the Blackwater Preserve. The caption was a single, baffled line. Camera trap number 7, month 4. It wasn't there yesterday. The drive into the preserve was a journey into a different world. The dense canopy of pine and cypress strangled the afternoon light, casting the winding forestry road in a perpetual green-tinged twilight. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, felt heavy in his lungs. Alex parked at a designated trailhead, the crunch of his own footsteps on the gravel path seeming obscenely loud in the cathedral silence. He was there to meet Ranger Evangeline Shaw, the woman who had first noticed the anomaly in her wildlife survey data. He found her waiting by a trail marker, a woman in her late 40s, with a pragmatic posture and eyes that missed nothing. Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct, but Alex detected a flicker of something guarded behind her professional demeanor, a scientist confronting data that defied her understanding. She led him off the main path, following a narrow, almost invisible game trail that wove through thickets of saw palmetto and beneath sprawling live oaks draped in ghostly Spanish moss. The air grew cooler. After 10 minutes of silent hiking, she stopped and pointed to a sturdy pine tree. Strapped to its trunk at waist height was a rugged camouflage-clad camera. This was the source of the photograph. As Evangeline retrieved the camera's memory card, her movements were careful, almost reverent. She spoke in a low, measured tone, explaining the purpose of her survey, to track the movements of black bears and panthers. The doll, she said, was not part of any natural ecosystem. Back at her truck, she opened a laptop balanced on the tailgate. The screen glowed brightly in the dim forest light. She pulled up a folder of images, a chronological record from this single camera. The first image was unremarkable. A dawn scene, a deer frozen in mid-step. She clicked through the days. Then it appeared. In one frame, the clearing was empty. In the next, taken just hours later, the doll was there. It was a vintage-style doll with a cracked porcelain face and faded blue eyes, seated primly against the oak root as if waiting for a tea party. It looked ancient, its lace dress in tatters. Evangeline continued clicking, her jaw tight. The story the images told was impossible. A week later, the first doll was gone. In its place was another, similar but distinct. This one had blonde ringlets instead of dark, and its dress was a different color. It was positioned in the exact same spot. Another week passed, and that doll too was replaced. And then another. It was not random vandalism. It was a sequence, a curated collection. But the most unsettling alteration came in the most recent batch of photos. The current doll, a boy doll in short trousers, had been found turned to face the camera directly, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and clutched in its tiny painted hand was a fresh, vibrant oak leaf, placed there with a precision that felt like a message, a deliberate communication from an unknown entity, using these silent plastic messengers to say something. Alex stared at the screen, the cheerful, vacant faces of the dolls seeming to mock him. This was no longer a wildlife survey. It was a gallery of the unnatural, a silent, one-sided conversation happening deep in the woods, and he was just beginning to decipher its terrifying language. Back in the sterile quiet of his study, the forest felt like a half-remembered dream. But the images on his screen were a brutal, waking reality. Alex had copied the entire folder from Ranger Shaw's camera, and now he immersed himself in the silent, digital theater of the clearing. He started a slideshow, the images flickering across his monitor in a relentless chronological parade. At first, he focused on the replacements, the subtle differences in hairstyle, dress, and material. It was a curator's work, a collection being displayed and exchanged with a fastidious, unsettling care. But as he progressed, slowing the slideshow to a crawl, his attention was snagged by something more insidious, more personal. The dolls' faces were changing. It was not a trick of the light or a result of weathering. In one sequence, a doll with a placid, almost smiling expression was replaced by the same doll, days later, its painted mouth now a downturned slash of black, its porcelain brow subtly furrowed by what could only be interpreted as anger. Another, a girl doll in a pink dress, seemed over time to acquire a gloss of moisture in its glass eyes, the vacant stare transforming into one of profound, plastic sorrow. A third appeared, with its head hung low, its posture one of utter defeat. They were not just dolls being swapped, they were vessels, their static features being manipulated to reflect a spectrum of raw human emotion. A cold knot tightened in Alex's stomach. He was not looking at a prank or an art installation. He was witnessing a performance, a pantomime of feeling played out by inanimate objects for an audience of one. A motion-activated camera in the woods. He began to chart the patterns, scribbling notes on a large sheet of paper taped to his wall. The emotional shifts of the dolls seemed to correlate with the weather. Periods of violent thunderstorms coincided with the appearances of the angry, contorted faces. Long gray days of drizzle were marked by dolls, expressing a deep, silent melancholy. A doll appearing after a night of a brilliant, star-filled full moon wore a look of serene, almost knowing, calm. It was as if the forest's own mood, the very temperament of nature, was being mirrored and reflected back through these unnatural proxies. The intertwining was seamless and horrifying. The natural world, the wind, the rain, the phases of the moon, was dictating the narrative of the unnatural, using these plastic and porcelain effigies as its medium. A profound dread began to grow within him, a cold seep of understanding that felt heavier than fear. This was not a haunting in the traditional sense. There was no ghostly figure, no disembodied voice. This was something more abstract, and therefore more terrifying. It was an intelligence, a consciousness that could manipulate physical objects and imbue them with symbolic meaning, that could read the emotional tenor of the world and translate it into a silent, visual language. It was communicating, and he was only just beginning to understand its grammar. The unanswered questions swarmed in his mind like gnats. Who or what was placing these dolls? For what purpose? Was it a warning, a plea, or simply a display of power? He leaned back from his desk, the glow of the monitor painting his face in a sickly blue light. The final image on the screen was the most recent one, the boy doll holding the oak leaf, its face a mask of neutral observation. It felt like a conclusion, or perhaps an intermission. The story was far from over, but this chapter had ended, leaving him with a haunting, residual unease. The entity in the woods, if it could be called that, had woven itself into the fabric of the forest, using the most innocent of objects to express the most complex of sentiments. It was a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit, a riddle whispered on the wind, and as Alex sat in the humming silence of his apartment, he knew with chilling certainty that the doll's vacant eyes had seen something he had not, and that its silent message was one he was only beginning to decode. The most terrifying warnings are not those shouted from a distance, but the ones discovered in the quiet intimacy of one's own home, etched into the very fabric of a sanctuary. Alex found himself contemplating this truth as he sat in the bright modern living room of Mark and Lisa, a young couple whose faces still bore the faint shadows of a recently exorcised dread. Their home was an airy testament to reclaimed beauty, a century-old Victorian that they had painstakingly restored, filling it with light and the clean scent of fresh paint and new wood. But as they began to speak, the cheerful space seemed to shrink, the tall, elegant windows becoming lenses focusing on a past darkness. Mark, an architect with a builder's calloused hands, spoke first, his voice steady, but his eyes occasionally darting towards a particular blank space on the wall, as if expecting to find something there. He described the initial excitement of the renovation, the thrill of uncovering original hardwood floors beneath layers of grimy linoleum and stripping decades of garish wallpaper from the plaster walls. The house had felt full of potential, a sleeping giant they were gently awakening. The master bedroom, however, had presented a peculiar challenge. A massive, ornately framed mirror, its silvering clouded and speckled with age, was bolted securely to the largest wall. It was heavy, unwieldy, and out of place with their minimalist aesthetic, but there was an odd finality to its installation, a sense that it was never meant to be moved. Lisa, a graphic designer with a perceptive gaze, took up the story, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her teacup. The decision to remove the mirror had been a practical one, made on a sunny Saturday afternoon. They wanted to hang their own art, to make the room truly theirs. Mark had fetched his tools, and together they had carefully unbolted the heavy frame from the wall. As they lifted it away, a cloud of dust motes danced in the sudden shaft of sunlight. And there, revealed on the newly exposed plaster, was the message. It wasn't painted or scrawled. It was etched, gouged into the wall with a frantic, desperate hand. Two simple words that sucked all the warmth from the room. Leave now. A cold silence had fallen between them in that sunlit bedroom, the cheerful sounds of the neighborhood outside suddenly feeling miles away. The message was not fresh graffiti. The plaster dust was settled deep within the grooves, the letters aged and stained. It was old, a warning left by someone long ago, hidden from view, waiting for them. Lisa described the immediate visceral shift in the atmosphere of their home. The pride of their renovation curdled into a sickening paranoia. The house was no longer a project. It was a secret, and they had just stumbled upon its most dire one. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the settling foundation, was no longer the charming song of an old house, but a potential footstep, a sign of the presence that had prompted that desperate hidden plea. The sanctuary they had built with their own hands now felt like a gilded cage, its walls suddenly thin and transparent, and they were the exhibit on display for an unseen, malevolent audience. The warning etched into the plaster was not a relic to be painted over and forgotten. It was a living, breathing curse that refused to be silenced. Mark and Lisa's story, which had begun with a single chilling discovery, spiraled into a relentless cycle of dread that stripped them of sleep and sanity. After finding the message, their first instinct had been one of pragmatic denial. They filled the grooves with spackle, sanded the wall to a smooth blank slate, and applied 2 thick coats of a cheerful, buttery yellow paint. The act felt like a ritual of cleansing, a reclamation of their space. For a few hours, a fragile peace settled over the bedroom, but it was a peace built on a foundation of sand. It was Lisa who found it the next morning. She had entered the room to open the curtains and let in the dawn light, her gaze automatically flicking to the freshly painted wall. And there it was, not in the exact same spot, but a foot to the left, as if it had slid sideways through the solid plaster. The same 2 words, leave now, were faintly visible beneath the new paint, bleeding through like a ghostly watermark. The frantic etching somehow transferred through layers of compound and latex. A cold terror, far colder than the first, seized her. This was not a static message from the past. It was an active, malevolent force. Panic set in. They decided the mirror itself was the key, the anchor for whatever was happening. They carried the heavy, ornate frame down to the basement, stuffing it into a dark corner behind the furnace, as if imprisoning it. That night, they lay awake in their bed, listening to the house, their ears straining for any sound from below. They heard nothing, but in the morning, a new message awaited them. This time, it was scratched into the frost on their bedroom window, the letters jagged and sharp. Leave now. They had moved the mirror, but the message had followed them upstairs. Driven by a frantic, sleep-deprived desperation, they tried everything. They moved the mirror to the garage. The words appeared, carved into the soft wood of their headboard. They took it to a storage unit across town, paying for a month's rent just to be rid of it. That night, they awoke to the sound of faint scraping from the living room. They found the message scrawled in the fine layer of dust on their television screen. It was a game of malignant whack-a-mole, and they were losing. Sleeplessness painted bruised shadows under their eyes. They jumped at the sound of the mail slot closing, flinched when the refrigerator hummed to life. Their home, their beautiful, restored sanctuary, had become a haunted maze, and the Minotaur at its center was a silent, inanimate object that projected its curse onto every surface. When Alex asked to see the mirror, they led him to the basement with the grim reluctance of people visiting a gravesite. The air was cool and smelled of damp concrete and old wood. The mirror stood propped against the stone foundation, its ornate frame looking like a crown of thorns in the dim light of a single bare bulb. Alex approached it slowly. The clouded glass did not clearly reflect the room. It showed a distorted, gloomy version of the basement, a world seen through a veil of age and sorrow. He reached out, not to touch the glass, but the frame. The wood was icy, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to leach the warmth from his fingertips. A cold that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. He felt it then, a presence. It was not a shape or a sound, but a pressure, a watchful stillness that emanated from the mirror itself. It felt ancient and patient, a consciousness that had been waiting behind that glass for a very long time. Staring into its murky depths, Alex understood. This was not a haunted house. It was a haunted object. The force tied to the mirror was not merely replaying a message like a broken record. It was intelligent, adaptive, and deeply malevolent. It was using the message as a tool, a psychological weapon to systematically dismantle the couple's sense of safety, to prove that nowhere was beyond its reach. The mirror was not just a reflector of images, it was a breach. A tiny, localized tear in reality through which something else could exert its will. The theory solidified in his mind, cold and hard as the mirror's frame. Their perception of safety was an illusion, a fragile construct that this entity was all too capable of shattering, one reappearing message at a time. There is a special kind of terror reserved for the open road at night, a primal fear that lives in the vast empty spaces between the islands of light, where the only certainty is the fragile shell of one's own vehicle and the relentless, swallowing dark. It was a terror that Emma, a university student whose life had previously been measured in lecture halls and library deadlines, now carried etched into the very rhythm of her pulse. Sitting across from Alex in a quiet campus coffee shop, the bright, mundane world of steaming lattes and chattering students seemed to press in on her. A flimsy diorama that could not contain the memory she held. Her hands, wrapped around a mug of tea she never sipped, were pale and still, but her eyes held a frantic, caged energy, as if still watching the road behind her. She had been driving back from a study group late on a Thursday night, a route she had taken a dozen times before. The highway was a ribbon of asphalt unfurling through sleeping farmland, punctuated only by the occasional glow of a distant homestead or the sudden blinding approach and swift departure of an oncoming truck. Her little sedan felt like a solitary spaceship, adrift in a sea of stars and blacktop. It was in her rearview mirror that she first saw it, a pair of headlights that materialized out of the darkness, maintaining a steady, unremarkable distance. She thought nothing of it at first, just another traveler on the long, lonely road. But the headlights began to creep closer, the distance shrinking not in a casual drift, but with a deliberate, predatory intent. Soon, they were riding her bumper, the bright halogen beams flooding her car with a harsh, invasive light, bleaching the color from her dashboard and throwing her own wide-eyed reflection back at her from the windshield. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She tapped her brakes lightly, a polite signal for the other driver to back off. The response was immediate and aggressive. The vehicle behind her, a dark, boxy SUV, its details obscured by the glare, swerved violently into the opposing lane, accelerated until its front grille was level with her driver's side window, and then swerved back behind her, its front bumper kissing her rear fender with a soft, terrifying thud. Panic, cold and sharp, injected itself into her veins. This was no impatient driver. This was a hunt. She stomped on the accelerator, her sedan lurching forward with a strained whine. The SUV matched her speed effortlessly, its engine a low, powerful growl that vibrated through her own car's frame. She tried to outmaneuver it, switching lanes, slowing down, speeding up. But the SUV was a phantom attached to her by an invisible tether, mirroring her every move with an unnatural balletic precision. It was playing with her. It would drop back, allowing a sliver of hope to bloom in her chest, only to surge forward again, its high beams flashing, once, twice, a silent, malevolent Morse code. The isolation of the landscape, once a peaceful emptiness, now became a suffocating prison. The farmhouses were too far away, their lights as distant and unreachable as stars. Her phone, tossed on the passenger seat, had no signal. She was utterly alone, a single frantic heartbeat in a vast, uncaring darkness, trapped in a high-speed cage with an unseen predator. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every rational thought was stripped away, leaving only the raw animal instinct to flee. She feared for her life with a certainty that was as absolute as the night outside her windows, her mind conjuring horrific tableaus of what would happen when, not if, the SUV finally forced her off the road. The vulnerability was total, a terrifying exposure that highlighted the fragile illusion of safety and control, reducing her world to the frantic red pulse of her own taillights and the two unwavering demonic eyes that pursued her from the relentless dark. The sanctuary of her own driveway, bathed in the mundane yellow glow of the porch light, had never felt so fragile. Emma had slammed her car door shut, her body trembling with a cocktail of adrenaline and residual terror, and fled inside, locking the deadbolt with shaking hands. For hours, she sat in the dark of her living room, jumping at every creak of the old house. The phantom image of those twin headlights burned onto her retinas. Sleep was impossible. The memory of the chase was a live wire in her mind, sparking and sizzling with every replay. It was in the cold gray light of dawn, a time that should have promised safety, that a new, more insidious dread began to take root. The dash cam. The small, discreet device was mounted behind her rearview mirror, a forgotten witness to the night's horror. With a feeling of grim necessity, she connected it to her laptop, the click of the USB cable sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The video file loaded, a time-stamped rectangle of darkness waiting to be unmuted. She pressed play, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The footage was exactly as she remembered it at first. The empty road, her own tense breathing audible over the hum of the engine, and then the appearance of the headlights. She watched herself panic, saw her car swerve, felt the ghost of the impact as the SUV nudged her bumper. It was a brutal first-person confirmation of her ordeal. But then, as the SUV surged forward to ride alongside her during one of its aggressive maneuvers, she saw it. The coffee shop around her seemed to dissolve, the cheerful clatter of cups fading into a distant, meaningless hum. Her blood ran cold, a sensation so profound it felt like her very marrow had turned to ice. The window of the SUV was down, and the driver's seat was empty. There was no shadowy figure, no glint of eyes in the darkness, no hands on the wheel. The interior of the vehicle was a black void. The steering wheel turned on its own, a perfect, smooth rotation as the car swerved back into her lane. The monstrous predatory behavior she had endured had not been orchestrated by a human being. It had been a driverless entity, a ton of metal and glass moving with a purpose all its own. A phantom car piloted by nothing but intent. Alex listened, the air in the coffee shop growing thick and heavy. Emma's voice was a bare whisper now, stripped of all emotion, as if the horror had scooped her clean. She described watching the footage over and over, pausing and zooming in, hoping to find some glitch, some reflection, some proof of a person slouched down in the seat. But there was nothing, just an empty cabin and a steering wheel that moved with a ghost's touch. The rational world, the one governed by physics and human agency, had fractured. Her fear was no longer just about the chase. It was about the fundamental nature of the thing that had chased her. It was a predator without a face, a threat that existed outside the boundaries of the known. Later, back in his study, Alex paced the length of the room, Emma's story echoing in the silence. The implications were staggering, blurring the lines he had been trying to define. This was not a ghost in a cabin or a message on a wall. This was a mobile, technological phantom, a haunting that could pursue you at 70 miles per hour down a public highway. It challenged every category. Was it a supernatural entity that had learned to wear a car like a suit of armor? Was it some form of sentient, malevolent AI, a glitch in the machine that had gained purpose? Or was it something else entirely? A new kind of phenomenon that defied both the natural and the supernatural. existing in the terrifying liminal space between. He went to his wall, to the sprawling, chaotic map of connected incidents. He picked up a red marker, his hand hovering over the blank space that represented Emma's story. With a slow, deliberate motion, he drew a new node and labeled it The Chase. Driverless entity. He then drew lines, connecting it to the pre-recorded 911 call, a ghost in the communication machine. He connected it to the dolls in the woods, objects manipulated by an unseen hand. He connected it to the mirror, an object that projected its will across a home. The pattern was no longer just about fear. It was about manifestation. It was about an intelligence that could hijack technology, manipulate objects, and now command a vehicle. The list of connected incidents was growing, and with each new addition, the entity he was tracking became less of a ghost story and more of a tangible, evolving threat, one that was learning to move through their world in increasingly direct and terrifying ways. Some places swallow sound, absorbing the echoes of the world into a deep, patient silence. The Henderson farm was one such place. Alex felt the change the moment his car tires crunched onto the long, unpaved driveway, the vibrant noise of the surrounding countryside seeming to fade, replaced by a watchful, heavy stillness. The farmhouse itself was a picture of faded Americana, its white paint peeling like sunburnt skin, its wraparound porch sagging with the weight of decades. But it was not the house that drew Alex. It was what lay in the overgrown yard, a dark, stone-circled maw in the earth. The well. He was greeted by the Hendersons, a family whose faces were etched with a fatigue that had nothing to do with physical labor. Tom Henderson, a broad-shouldered man who looked like he could wrestle a bull, had a hesitant grip and eyes that kept darting towards the kitchen window, which framed a perfect view of the well. His wife, Clara, offered a strained smile that didn't reach her eyes, her hands constantly wringing a dish towel into a tight knot. Their two children, a boy and a girl of maybe 8 and 10, sat silently on the living room floor, not playing, just watching the adults with a solemn understanding that was far too old for their years. They didn't waste time on pleasantries. The well, Tom explained, his voice a low rumble, had been on the property since the land was first settled. It had been sealed with a heavy iron-banded lid decades before they bought the place, a forgotten relic. For years, it was just part of the scenery. Then, about 6 months ago, the sound started. Not the drip and echo of water, but something else. A wet, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across stone. A low, guttural humming that seemed to vibrate up through the ground itself. Sometimes, late at night, they would hear what sounded like scratching, as if long, desperate fingers were scraping at the underside of the sealed lid from far, far below. Driven by a mixture of fear and a desperate need for a rational explanation, Tom had decided to investigate. He procured a waterproof endoscope camera, a slender, flexible cable with a light on its tip, designed for peering into engines and pipes. One crisp autumn afternoon, with his family watching from the porch, a safe distance away, he drilled a small hole through the center of the ancient wooden lid. The air that sighed out was frigid and carried a scent of wet stone and something else, something vaguely organic and foul. With trembling hands, he fed the camera into the darkness. Alex listened, the cozy living room feeling like a submarine descending into deep black water. Clara picked up the story, her voice barely a whisper. They had all crowded around the small monitor connected to the camera. The screen showed a grainy, green-hued descent into absolute blackness. The light on the tip of the cable pierced the gloom, illuminating the damp, moss-slicked stone walls of the well shaft as it dropped down, down, far deeper than any well had a right to be. The only sound was the whir of the cable unspooling and the frantic thumping of their own hearts. Then, the image on the monitor changed. The shaft opened up into a wider, subterranean space, a cavern that shouldn't have existed. The camera's light, a lone star in that absolute dark, swept across the void, and for one single horrifying second, it illuminated a figure. It was pale and hunched, clinging to the cavern wall like some monstrous albine insect. Its form was vaguely humanoid, but stretched and wrong, with limbs that seemed too long and jointed at unnatural angles. It had no discernible face, just a smooth, featureless expanse, where one should be. But the most chilling detail, the one that froze the blood in their veins, was that it was looking up. It was looking directly into the camera's light, its head tilted in a gesture of predatory curiosity. A collective gasp had torn from the family on the porch. In that same instant, a guttural electronic shriek erupted from the monitor's speaker, a sound of tearing metal and distorted fury. The screen dissolved into a storm of frantic white static. Tom, his instincts screaming, yanked the cable back up with all his strength. When he pulled it from the hole, the end of the endoscope was mangled, the lens shattered, the metal casing twisted, as if by immense, crushing force. They sealed the hole with concrete that same day, but it felt like a futile gesture. The damage was done. The terrifying glimpse of the figure lurking in the impossible deep, the intelligence in its faceless gaze, had seared itself into their minds. They were no longer just afraid of strange sounds. They were living with the certain knowledge that something was down there, something that knew they were there too. It had seen them as clearly as they had seen it. As Alex drove away from the farm, the image of that pale, clinging figure haunted him. This was different from the other stories. This wasn't a ghost in a machine or a malevolent presence in a home. This was something physical, something that inhabited a real, tangible space in the world, a thing that lived in the dark, wet earth beneath a family's home. The connection wasn't immediately clear, but he felt it, a cold, logical thread weaving through the chaos. The entity, in all its forms, needed a conduit, a recording, a mirror, a doll, a car, and now, a well. It was a point of access, a doorway, and he was more determined than ever to find the links that connected these doorways, to map the anatomy of the fear that was slowly, methodically revealing itself to him. The evidence of the impossible was no longer a collection of disparate nightmares, but a constellation of dread, and Alex was the astronomer charting its malevolent patterns. His study had transformed from a writer's sanctuary into a command center for an investigation into the unnatural. The walls were a mosaic of madness, plastered with photographs, maps, and timelines, all connected by a spiderweb of red string and frantic handwritten notes. In the center of it all, Alex sat, the hum of his computer a constant companion to the roaring silence of his thoughts. The individual terrors, the recorded voice, the whispering cabin, the emotive dolls, the haunted mirror, the driverless car, the thing in the well. were no longer isolated incidents. They were chapters in a single horrifying manuscript, and he was finally beginning to read the language in which it was written. His focus narrowed to a single chilling common denominator: media. Every single story involved a recording, an image, or a sign that defied rational explanation. The 911 call was a pre-recorded message of a man's terror, broadcast into the present. The dolls in the woods were a sequence of images, a silent film of manipulated emotion captured by a camera trap. The mirror projected its warning onto any surface, a visual curse that refused to be erased. The dashcam footage revealed a predator without a pilot, a ghost in the machine of a modern vehicle. Even the well involved a camera, a brief digital glimpse into a subterranean horror. It was as if the entity, or the phenomenon he was tracking, had a parasitic relationship with technology and perception. It used them as a canvas, a speaker, a mouthpiece. It didn't just haunt places, it haunted the very methods humans used to document and understand their world. He began to map the correlations on a large sheet of drafting paper, his pen moving with a frantic energy. He charted the emotional resonance of each event, the pure desperation of the 911 call, the paranoid claustrophobia of the cabin, the symbolic communication of the dolls, the psychological warfare of the mirror, the predatory aggression of the chase, the primal subterranean horror of the well. The themes of fear were not random. They were a spectrum, a comprehensive exploration of terror, from the psychological to the physical, from the ancient to the technological. They were converging, weaving together into a single complex tapestry of the unknown. The entity was not just causing fear, it was studying it, cataloging it, expressing it through different mediums, like an artist experimenting with paints. The weight of the mystery settled upon him, a physical pressure on his shoulders, and a cold stone in his gut. This was no longer just a book, it was an obsession. The line between investigator and subject was blurring. He had sought out these stories, but now he felt them seeking him out in return. He would catch a glimpse of his own reflection in a dark window and flinch, half expecting to see the words, "Leave now," etched across the glass. The sound of a car engine gunning outside his apartment at night would send a jolt of adrenaline through his system, his mind instantly flashing to Emma's desperate flight. He had immersed himself so deeply in the anatomy of fear that he was now living inside its ribcage, feeling the beat of its terrible heart as his own. He leaned back, his eyes scanning the chaotic web of information on the wall. The connections were there, undeniable and terrifying. He was no longer chasing ghosts. He was profiling a consciousness, an intelligence that was ancient, yet adept with modern tools, that was capable of profound malice, yet operated with a chilling symbolic logic. It communicated, it manipulated, it hunted, and it hid. And it was doing so through a curated series of encounters, a pattern that was escalating in both boldness and complexity. The initial thrill of the hunt was gone, replaced by a grim, cold dread. He was not just writing about the unknown, he was staring directly into its faceless eyes, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that it was staring back. The mystery had its hooks in him, and the more he struggled to understand it, the deeper they sank. The archives of the County Historical Society smelled of decaying paper and forgotten stories. A scent that clung to the back of Alex's throat as he sat hunched over a wide, varnished table. Towering stacks of leather-bound ledgers, brittle newspapers, and faded personal diaries formed precarious canyon walls around him, isolating him in a world of ink and dust. The fluorescent lights above buzzed a flat, monotonous note, their harsh glow failing to reach the deep shadows in the corners of the high-ceilinged room. This was the antithesis of the digital phantoms he had been chasing, a tangible physical hunt through the sediment of time. He was no longer just collecting stories. He was digging for the root, the first seed from which this sprawling, terrifying tree of incidents had grown. The initial hours were a lesson in frustration, a slow sifting through census records, property deeds, and minutes from long-defunct town councils. He found tales of floods and fires, of economic booms and busts, but nothing that resonated with the specific technological malevolence he was tracking. It was in a box of unsorted materials, donated from the estate of a reclusive local historian, that his fingers brushed against a folio of loose yellowed pages, their edges crumbling like dry leaves. They were handwritten notes, the script a tight, spidery cursive that slanted aggressively across the page, as if the writer had been in a great hurry or a state of high agitation. The pages were untitled, undated, but they spoke of a legend, a local folktale that had never made it into the official published histories. The writer referred to it only as the Echo. According to the notes, it was not a ghost or a demon in the traditional sense, but a consciousness that had no voice of its own. It was a parasitic entity, a spiritual mimic that fed on human emotion, specifically terror, and required a physical conduit to express itself. It was drawn to objects that held resonance, mirrors that had reflected a lifetime of faces, dolls that had been cherished by children, wells that were openings to the deep, silent earth. Most chillingly, the note suggested that the echo was not static. It evolved. It learned. As humanity developed new ways to record and communicate, writing, photography, audio recordings, digital signals, the echo learned to use these tools as well, its voice growing clearer, its manifestations more sophisticated with each technological leap. It was an entity that had started by scratching warnings on walls and had graduated to hijacking radio waves and manipulating digital images. The legend was a perfect, terrifying key, sliding into the lock of every story Alex had collected. Armed with this fragment of folklore, Alex sought validation. He scheduled interviews with folklorists and parapsychologists, men and women who had built careers on the fringes of accepted science. He met Dr. Alistair Finch in a book-lined office at the university, a man with a kind, weary face and eyes that had seen too many true believers come and go. Alex laid out his theory, his voice tight, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, presenting the pattern of the stories and the legend of the echo as corroborating evidence. Dr. Finch listened patiently, steepling his fingers. But his response was a gentle, firm wall of skepticism. He spoke of confirmation bias, of the human brain's innate desire to find patterns in chaos, of how a compelling story can connect unrelated events into a satisfying but false narrative. He called the legend of the echo a classic example of a proto-meme, a folkloric virus that adapted to the fears of the age. "You're not tracking an entity, Mr. Vance," he said, his tone not unkind. "You are constructing one." The dismissal should have deflated him, should have sent him back to his desk to reconsider his life's work. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The skepticism was like a whetstone, sharpening his resolve to a fine, hard point. He saw not a debunking, but a confirmation of the echo's genius. It didn't just hide in the shadows. It hid in the blinding light of rational explanation. It used the very mechanisms of doubt and reason as its camouflage. He returned to his study, the legend of the echo now pinned to the center of his wall, the spider at the heart of the web. He looked at the timeline of incidents again, and this time he saw not just a pattern, but an escalation. The encounters were growing bolder, more direct, more personal. The pre-recorded call was a broadcast into the void. The dolls were a symbolic display for a camera. The mirror was a targeted campaign of psychological terror on a specific family. The chase was a direct, physical threat to an individual on a public road. It was a progression from the abstract to the intimate, from communication to confrontation. The echo was no longer just sending messages. It was testing its reach, probing the boundaries of its influence, and with a cold, dawning certainty, Alex understood that his investigation was not just observing this escalation. He was becoming a part of it. He was the next logical step in its terrifying evolution. The line between observer and participant is a filament so fine that one only notices it has been severed when the darkness comes rushing in. For weeks, Alex had lived in the world of other people's nightmares, a curator of terror who believed his own life existed safely on the other side of the glass. His study was his fortress, a room lined with the armor of reason and research, where fear was a subject to be analyzed, not a force to be endured. But that illusion of safety, so carefully constructed, was about to be dismantled piece by piece, not by a story told to him, but by the story that had decided to tell itself through him. The entity he had been so diligently tracking had finally turned its gaze upon the tracker. It began with the silence, not the ordinary quiet of a late-night writing session, but a profound, predatory hush that seemed to swallow the familiar hum of his computer and the distant sigh of city traffic. The air in the room grew thick and cold, a chill that had no source in the autumn evening outside his window. Alex paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, the sentence he was writing forgotten. He felt a prickle at the nape of his neck, the ancient instinctual warning of unseen eyes. He was not alone. The conviction was absolute, a cold stone of certainty that dropped into his gut. He tried to dismiss it as fatigue, the natural result of too many hours steeped in dark tales, but the feeling only intensified, a pressure building in the room like a coming storm. Then, the whispers began. They were not audible sounds that traveled through the air to his eardrums, but thoughts that were not his own, blooming directly in his mind. They were sibilant and fragmented, echoes of the desperate pleas from the 911 call, the paranoid mutterings from the cabin, the silent screams from the well. They wove together into a tapestry of borrowed terror, a chorus of fear speaking with a single alien voice. He clapped his hands over his ears, a futile gesture against an internal assault, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The whispers were not trying to communicate. They were an infestation, a psychic violation that left him feeling soiled and exposed. As if in response to his panic, the physical world began to rebel. On his desk, a heavy ceramic coffee mug, empty and cold, slid 6 inches to the left of its own accord, the scrape of its movement unnaturally loud in the stifling silence. The papers on his bulletin board rustled, though the window was sealed shut. A book on the shelf behind him, a thick volume on local folklore, tipped forward and fell to the floor with a deafening thud. These were not the random creaks and settles of an old building. They were deliberate, intelligent actions. He was being shown that the rules of his reality were no longer in effect. The fortress of his study had been breached, and the enemy was already inside the walls. He spun in his chair, his breath catching in his throat. In the dark corner of the room, where the light from his desk lamp failed to reach, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness. It was not the absence of light, but a solidity that consumed it, a humanoid shape of pure black that seemed to ripple and shift like smoke. It had no features, no face, yet he felt its attention fix upon him with the weight of a physical blow. It was there for only a second, a fleeting impression of a hunched shoulder and a too long limb, before it dissolved back into the ordinary shadows from which it had emerged. But the image was seared into his mind, a perfect match for the pale, clinging thing from the well, its negative, its shadow self. In that moment of pure, unadulterated terror, the final chilling realization crashed down upon him. He was no longer the journalist writing the book. He had become a character within it. The entity, the echo, was not just a subject of his investigation. It was the author of his current predicament. It had infiltrated his life not through a phone line or a haunted mirror, but through the very act of his pursuit. By seeking it out, by connecting its disparate manifestations, he had woven himself into its narrative, offering himself as the next conduit for its expression. The fear he had so clinically documented in others was now his to live, a raw, personal horror that stripped away all academic distance and left him naked and trembling in the presence of the impossible. The encounter was not a haunting, it was a claiming. The aftermath of the encounter was not a silence, but a ringing void, an echo chamber of his own shattered certainty. For days, Alex moved through his life like a ghost, the mundane world of traffic lights and grocery stores, feeling like a flimsy film projected over a deeper, darker reality. The entity had not returned, but its presence lingered, a stain on the atmosphere of his home, a constant cold pressure at the edge of his perception. The fear was no longer an abstract concept he studied. It was the very air he breathed. It was this pervasive dread that finally drove him back to the one place he had been avoiding, the heart of the storm, his study. The chaotic mosaic on the wall was no longer a map of a mystery. It was a blueprint of his own haunting. He had to understand the architect. He began with the legend of the echo, the spidery cursive notes from the historical society. He cross-referenced every detail with the timelines of his collected stories, overlaying the folklore with the cold, hard data of the incidents. The dates began to align with a terrifying symmetry. A period of intense paranormal activity in the 1970s, documented in the notes, coincided with the rise of consumer audio recording technology. A lull, and then a new wave in the early 2000s, mirroring the proliferation of digital cameras and the internet. The entity was not just using technology. Its very cycles of activity were tied to technological evolution. It was a parasite that fed on the tools of human progress. The breakthrough came from a footnote In an obscure engineering journal, he found buried in the university's digital archives an article about early experiments in electromagnetic field recording. The theory, widely dismissed as pseudoscience, suggested that intense emotional trauma could, under specific conditions, imprint itself onto the local environment, creating a kind of psychic recording that could later be triggered or replayed. It was a scientific ghost story, but it provided the missing link. He combined it with the legend of the echo, a consciousness born of trauma, a vengeful spirit without a voice of its own, a silent scream that had learned to use the world as its vocal cords. Piecing together property records, old newspaper clippings, and the fragmented family histories from the hidden compartment in the cabin, he found the source. In 1958, a reclusive inventor named Elias Vance, a distant, forgotten relation, the name a cold shock to his system, had lived in a house on the land where the cabin now stood. Vance was a man ahead of his time, obsessed with capturing the human soul on magnetic tape. His wife and young daughter had vanished under mysterious circumstances, the official report citing a likely abduction, though no bodies were ever found. The case went cold. But Elias never stopped searching. His notes, which Alex tracked down to a private collector, spoke of a breakthrough, a device he claimed could play back the echoes of the past, to hear the final moments of his lost family. The last entry was a frantic, barely legible scrawl. "It's not an echo, it's a listener. It learned my grief. It's using the machine. It's wearing their faces." Elias Vance had not found his family. He had instead given a voice, a purpose, and a method to the formless trauma of their loss. The entity, the echo, was not his wife or daughter, but a thing born from the cataclysmic energy of their tragedy. A vengeful spirit that had learned to parasitize Elias's technology to manifest. It had consumed his grief, his rage, his desperate love, and had been using that emotional template ever since, evolving alongside each new form of media, forever seeking new ways to express its borrowed, agonized existence. It was a ghost in the machine, yes, but the machine was merely its newest instrument. The original sin was a loss so profound, it had scarred reality itself. The revelation did not bring clarity, it brought a moral abyss. To expose this truth in his book would be to give the echo its largest audience yet, to feed it with the fear and fascination of thousands of readers. It would be handing a vengeful, evolving phantom a megaphone, potentially accelerating its capabilities in ways he could not foresee. Yet, to remain silent, to bury the truth, was to abandon all the people it had already terrorized: Maria, Sarah, Mark, and Lisa, Emma, the Hendersons, to their confusion and fear, and to leave future victims unprepared. He would be protecting the world from a truth it couldn't handle, but also leaving it vulnerable to a predator it didn't believe in. He sat in the deepening twilight, the weight of the decision crushing him. The truth was a weapon, and he held it in his hands, unsure whether to brandish it or bury it. He had sought the story of a lifetime, and he had found it: a sentient curse, a self-replicating fear, a ghost that had learned to code. The security he had once felt in the solidity of the world, in the reliability of cause and effect, was utterly shattered. The universe was not just stranger than he imagined. It was actively, malevolently hostile, home to things that wore tragedy as a skin and used human innovation as a weapon. He was no longer just a man with a story. He was the keeper of a terrible secret, standing at a crossroads where every path forward seemed to lead deeper into the dark. The book was a physical object, a weight in his hands that felt both like a triumph and a tombstone. Echoes, a chronicle of modern hauntings, sat on bookstore shelves, its stark minimalist cover belying the storms of terror contained within. Reviewers called it chillingly plausible and a masterwork of psychological dread. Readers devoured the stories of the pre-recorded 911 call, the whispering cabin, the emotive dolls, the haunted mirror, the driverless chase, and the thing in the well. They discussed the connections in online forums, dissecting Alex's theory of the echo with the fervor of amateur detectives. He had done it. He had woven 8 disparate nightmares into a single terrifying tapestry and presented it to the world. He should have felt vindicated, cleansed, the weight of the mystery lifted by the act of its publication. Instead, the stories had taken up permanent residence in the architecture of his mind. They were no longer case files. They were memories, his memories. The silence in his apartment was no longer just silence. It was the prelude to Maria's recorded plea, or the wet dragging sound from the bottom of the well. The reflection in his bathroom mirror was not just his own tired face. It was a potential canvas for a phantom warning. Headlights in his rearview mirror on a dark road were not just traffic. They were a potential predator. A ton of metal piloted by nothing but malicious intent. The publication had not been an exorcism. It had been a ratification. By giving the entity a name and a history, he had made it more real, more potent. He had built a cage of words for it, only to find that he was now locked inside with it. He found himself engaging in small, private rituals of denial. He covered the mirror in his hallway with a sheet. He avoided driving at night. He unplugged his landline, the memory of a call that was not a call, too vivid to bear. The world had become a minefield of triggers, every mundane object and everyday sound, a potential doorway back into the horror. The success of the book meant he was in demand. Radio interviews, podcast appearances, a potential documentary. Each time he spoke the stories aloud, he felt a little piece of himself erode, as if he were not recounting events, but summoning them, feeding the echo with the fear of his new, vast audience. He had become a high priest in a church of dread, and his sermons were making the gods stronger. Late one night, sitting in the blue glow of his computer screen, he scrolled through the reader emails that flooded his inbox. Most were expressions of thanks or shared stories of their own strange experiences. But one, sent from a throwaway account, stood out. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained only a single hyperlinked phrase. You left one out. A cold finger of dread traced its way down his spine. He clicked the link. It opened a private video hosting site. The video was dark, shaky, filmed on a phone. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust, but when they did, he recognized the setting with a jolt of nausea. It was the clearing in the Blackwater Preserve, the site of the doll sequence. The camera panned across the forest floor, the image jerky. And there, propped against the same gnarled oak root, was a new doll. This one was different. It was not vintage or porcelain. It was a cheap modern action figure, and it was dressed in a tiny, meticulously crafted replica of the jacket Alex had been wearing during his last television interview. The video ended. He sat frozen, the hum of the computer now a deafening roar in his ears. It was no longer just about the stories he had collected. It was about him. The echo was not just still out there. It was watching him, studying him, incorporating him into its ongoing narrative. It was reflecting him back at himself, using his own image as its latest medium. The veil between the world he documented and the world he inhabited was not just thin. It was gone, dissolved entirely. He had published his book thinking he was closing a chapter, but he had only written the introduction to his own. The enduring mystery was no longer an academic pursuit. It was the chilling, intimate certainty that the entity was not only still out there, but that it knew his name, his face, and his address. And it was just getting started.